Before the lights ever go down, Abner Sowell asks the young range officer one quiet question about a rifle rack nobody else will discuss. "You seeing what I'm seeing?" Wyatt said, low, from behind the check-in table. "Or is that coat older than both of us put together?" The other clerk, a girl named Priya, who'd worked the sign-in sheet at Quarrytown Rod and Gun Club for exactly one centennial season, didn't answer right away. She was watching the man cross the gravel lot in the sodium light, watching the particular unhurried way his weight moved, like a man crossing a floor he'd walked 10,000 times in the dark. "Barn coat," she said finally. "My grandfather had one just like it, canvas gone the color of a fence post." "He on the list?" "Sowell, Abner." She ran a finger down the roster, found the name wedged between two members who'd paid dues that morning. "Been a member since before either of our parents met, looks like." Wyatt snorted, not unkindly, and waved toward the floor manager, a barrel-built man named Deke, who was already threading through the crowd with a cordless microphone and the particular energy of someone who has rehearsed his own jokes. "Deke's gonna have a field day." He did. Deke caught sight of Abner at the doorway, coat buttoned to the throat, despite the warmth of 40 bodies packed into the old quarry building, and he didn't miss a beat. Folks, before we get started, somebody find this gentleman a folding chair," Deke called out, grinning at the room, working it like a stage. "And a nightlight, so he can find the men's room later." Laughter rippled through the crowd, easy and cheap, the kind that costs the laugher nothing and the laughed at everything. A few members glanced over, smiling behind their drinks. Abner didn't look up. He unbuttoned the top button of his coat, slow, and kept walking toward the sign-in table like the joke had been about someone else entirely. $40,000 was already written on the whiteboard behind Deke, in blue marker, boxed and underlined twice. Carrington Precision Arms had put up the wager itself. Full darkness, a rifle field stripped and rebuilt blind, first man to do it clean and fast, name to be drawn at random from a hat, though everyone in the room understood by now that a private demonstration always finds its stunt volunteer. If a quiet answer has ever landed heavier than a loud one in your own life, you already know how this night ends. Abner reached the table. Priya slid the pen toward him without quite meeting his eyes, the way you do with someone you've already decided is harmless. He signed his name in a hand steadier than hers, set the pen down parallel to the sign-in sheet's edge, exactly parallel, and turned his whole body, not just his head, to take in the room. The rack of gleaming factory demonstration rifles up front, the old service weapons locked in a glass case along the east wall, dust motes catching the light above 100 years of limestone dug out from under the building's own floor. 90 minutes to lights out, Wyatt murmured to Priya, checking the clock above the door. 9:40, the club's centennial curfew, non-negotiable. The kind of hour a building this old had kept for 100 years before either of them were born. "You think the old fella's even gonna make it that long?" Priya didn't answer. She was watching Abner's right shoulder, how it hung a few degrees lower than the left, how he'd angled his whole stance rather than reach across his body for anything. She didn't know yet what that meant. Neither did anyone else in the room. But something in the deliberate economy of the man, the way he did not waste a single motion crossing 40 feet of concrete floor, had already put a small, unplaceable itch behind her sternum, the kind that arrives long before the mind can name what caused it. The coat, up close, wasn't merely old. It was maintained, brushed at the collar, mended once at the left cuff, with thread a shade darker than the canvas, and worn through at the right pocket in a shape no tailor would have cut on purpose. A small oval, soft-edged, rubbed down to nothing by the same object passing in and out of it for longer than the building had held its centennial banner. Whatever lived in that pocket, it went everywhere with him, it had for years. He kept his keys in his left hand until he found the little dish by the coat rack meant for raffle tickets, and he set them down there instead, in the same corner every regular member used, though nobody had told him where the dish was. He simply knew the room the way a man knows a house he built with his own hands. He checked his watch, an old wind-up, wound tight, the crystal scratch translucent, and did the arithmetic silently. 9:40, 90 minutes and some change. Enough time, if things went the way they were supposed to. He had told Twyla he'd be home by 10, and in 52 years of marriage, he had broken that kind of promise perhaps 3 times, each one for a reason grave enough that she'd never once asked him to account for it. She would already be on the porch by 9:30 regardless, because that was the ritual, unspoken and unbroken. The yellow bulb switched on the moment supper dishes were dried, whether he was 5 minutes from the door or 5 hours, so that no matter what hour he finally came up the gravel drive, there'd be a light waiting that hadn't been lit for anyone else. He thought of it now, briefly, the way another man might check a compass. Then he put his attention back on the room, and specifically on the young man near the demonstration table who kept glancing at the locked glass case along the east wall, as if it had asked him a question he didn't know how to answer. That young man was Austin Nunnally, 26 years old, 18 months into the job of junior range officer, sharp enough to have noticed that the case's brass plate read, "Original service rack, condemned," in stenciling faded almost to nothing, and green enough to have never once heard anybody explain why. Roland Carrington took the floor at 8:15, and whatever else could be said about him, the room did not laugh when he worked. He was 34, built like a man who still played something competitive on weekends, and he moved through his demonstration the way certain salesmen move through a pitch they have delivered so many times it has become a kind of dance. He carried a laminated spec card in his left hand, flipping it between 2 fingers, a habit so ingrained it looked less like a nervous tick than a metronome keeping the pace of his own voice. "By the numbers," he said, and the room quieted the way rooms quiet for people who have earned the right to be heard. 4.2 seconds to strip. 6.1 to rebuild, function checked, safety verified. He set a rifle, one of his own company's showpieces, a rebuilt classic service pattern with a barrel bright as a mirror, on the felt-covered table and ran through it once for the crowd at full speed. Hands a blur of trained motion, bolt out, extractor checked, hammer group free, and back together clean, in just over 10 seconds all told. Real applause followed, warranted and warm. Whatever else was true of Roland Carrington, he had put in the hours to earn that ovation, and nobody in the building, including Abner, begrudged him a second of it. "That's the bar," Carrington said, riding the applause down to its natural end before it fully died. "Now we drew names for tonight's demonstration wager, and I want to be fair about how we run this." He held up the sign-in sheet, scanned it, and stopped a beat too long on one line near the bottom. A small smile crossed his face, the kind a man wears when he's decided a joke is about to write itself. "Abner Sowell," he read aloud, and something in his tone made the name sound smaller than it was. He looked up, found Abner near the coat rack, and let the pause stretch just long enough to be cruel, without ever quite crossing into cruelty a bystander could name outright. "Sir, I want to say this with respect. You're a member in good standing, and Quarrytown's proud to have you, but this next round's a blackout reassembly, full darkness, time to the second, $40,000 on the table for whoever beats my numbers." He gestured at the case of demonstration rifles, bright under the hanging lights, and then, almost gently, toward the door. "I'd hate for you to strain something proving a point nobody's asking you to prove. You're welcome to sit this one out. Dignity, fully intact." A ripple of laughter went through the crowd again, softer this time, edged with something like discomfort, the sound people make when they've laughed before they've decided whether they should. Deke, still holding his microphone near the back, grinned and mouthed something to Wyatt that might have been, "Told you." Abner didn't answer right away. He crossed the floor toward the felt table at his own pace, unhurried, the same economy of motion he'd used walking in from the lot, and picked up Carrington's showpiece rifle from where it lay disassembled, turning it once in the light, weighing it in one hand, the way a man weighs a stone he's deciding whether to skip. He set it back down exactly where he'd found it, barrel aligned with the table's edge. "I signed the sheet," he said, 3 words, no more, and something in the flatness of them made the laughter behind him die a half-second sooner than it would have on its own. Carrington's smile didn't fully leave his face, but it thinned at the edges, the practiced warmth of a man recalibrating in real time. "All right," he said, spreading his hands, playing to the room again. "All right then. $40,000 says otherwise. He flipped the spec card once more between his fingers, a small habitual click of laminate against laminate, and half the room laughed with him, and half the room, for reasons they couldn't yet articulate, did not. Austin Nunnally was one of the ones who didn't. He stood near the east wall, close enough to the glass case that he could see his own reflection ghosted over the dulled stencil reading that condemned. And he watched the old man's hands rather than his face, the way they'd handled Carrington's rifle like it weighed nothing at all and everything at once. Abner said very little through the rest of the cited demonstration, and what he did say, he said only once, quietly, to Austin, while Carrington reset the felt table for the timing round, and the room's attention drifted toward the whiteboard and its blue marker number. He was watching Carrington's hands the whole time Carrington spoke, not his face, not the spec card flipping between two fingers like a coin trick meant to keep an audience's eyes moving, but the actual work his fingers did on the rifle itself. He watched where the thumb pressed against the takedown pin, watched the exact angle at which the bolt carrier came free, watched for the small hitch that tells an armorer whether a man learned a rifle from a manual or from another man's hands. Carrington's motions were fast and clean, and Abner noted, without any satisfaction in the noting, entirely correct. Whatever else the young dealer was selling tonight, his hands themselves told no lies. "You know your work," Abner said to no one in particular, low enough that only Austin, standing nearest, caught it. Austin glanced at him, surprised to be addressed at all. "Sir?" "Carrington. He knows a rifle." Abner nodded once toward the felt table, where the dealer was chalking a starting line on the floor for the timed round. "That's not the trouble." "Then what is?" Abner didn't answer that directly. Instead he turned, his whole body, the fixed shoulder dictating the movement, the way it dictated all his movements, and looked toward the east wall, toward the locked glass case with its faded stencil, and asked the question he'd apparently walked in carrying. "Does the club still have its original rack, the service rifles, the ones marked condemned?" He said it plainly, without weight, the way a man asks whether a road is still open. Austin blinked. Sir, I've only been here a season and a half. I know the case is there. I didn't know there was a rack behind it, or what condemned means exactly. Nobody's briefed me on it." He looked toward the case himself now, as if seeing it for the first time, as something other than furniture. "Why?" "No reason yet," Abner said, which was not quite true, and something in the careful economy of the lie, if it even was one, made Austin's stomach tighten in a way he couldn't explain to himself. 3 feet away, a board member named Halloran, gray-templed and normally the loudest voice at any club function, had gone very quiet over his drink. He didn't turn around, he didn't ask what they were talking about, but his hand, resting on the bar rail, had gone still in a way that suggested he'd heard the question perfectly well and had decided, in the space of half a second, that answering it was somebody else's job. Austin noticed. He filed it away, the way you file away a loose board in a porch step, not urgent, but not forgotten either, and turned his attention back to the felt table, where Carrington was calling the room to order for the timed blackout round. $40,000 boxed in blue marker on the whiteboard behind him, and 90 minutes, less some, standing between now and the club's 100-year curfew. The lights went out at 9 minutes past 9, all of them at once. The old quarry building swallowed into a dark so total that even the exit signs seemed to dim in sympathy. Somewhere in that blackness, a stopwatch clicked to life, its small mechanical voice, the only sound in a room holding its breath. Carrington had set the terms himself, a rifle already field-stripped and scattered on the felt table, the parts arranged by Austin under supervised light so no one could claim advantage, and then total darkness, and then the timer. Beat his own cited number of 10.3 seconds, and the $40,000 belonged to whoever proved it. Fail, and the joke that had opened the evening would have the last word after all. Abner's hands found the felt in the dark without hesitation, the way a man finds his own front door in a house he's owned for decades. He did not fumble for the parts. He located them in a fixed order, an order that had apparently never changed in longer than Austin Nunnally had been alive, receiver first, held flat against his palm to orient it by weight and balance alone. Then the bolt carrier, drawn in along a path his fingers already knew before they arrived. Then the recoil assembly, seated with a small, exact pressure that produced no fumbling and no wasted travel. Somewhere around the second beat of the stopwatch, his right hand slid into the worn pocket of the barn coat and came out with the disassembly punch. A slim tool, no longer than a pencil, its handle filed down over years until it had taken on the exact contour of his palm, a private shape that fit no other hand in the building. He didn't need light to find the pin it was meant for. He'd found that pin 10,000 times in the dark of ranges and armories that no longer existed except in his own hands. The room listened rather than watched, because watching had been taken from them, and in that forced attention, every small click and seat of metal against metal carried the weight of a held note. A pin dropped free with a whisper, a spring compressed, released, locked. The bolt carrier slid home with a sound like a held breath, finally let go. Somebody in the front row, timing along under their own count, whispered a number that didn't matter yet, because the stopwatch was the only clock anyone trusted tonight. Then the lights came back up, all at once, and Abner Sowell was standing at the felt table with a fully reassembled rifle resting in both hands, safety checked, bolt forward, exactly as still as if he'd been holding it that way for an hour. The stopwatch, when Carrington finally looked down at it, read 7.9 seconds. Nobody laughed. Nobody spoke. Deke, still holding his microphone near the back wall, had it lowered halfway to his side, mouth open on a joke that had died somewhere behind his teeth. Wyatt and Priya, still stationed at the check-in table, looked at each other and then quickly away, the way people do when they've just watched something they don't yet have the vocabulary to describe to one another later. Carrington stared at the stopwatch a second longer than the number required, as if a second look might change the arithmetic. It did not. 7.9 against his own 10.3, in a room he'd built the entire evening around proving the opposite outcome. He started and stopped, and started again, quieter. That's a fast time. He said it like a man setting a stone down carefully so it wouldn't crack the floor. Abner set the rifle on the felt, barrel aligned with the table's edge exactly as before, and slid the punch back into the worn pocket of his coat. He didn't smile. He didn't look at the crowd, though the crowd was very much looking at him now. 40 faces gone quiet in the particular way a room goes quiet when it realizes it has misjudged something it cannot take back. Lucky guess, Abner said, 2 words. It was the driest thing said all night, and it was not, by any measure available to the room, believed by a single person in it. Carrington's recovery came fast, the way a man trained to sell recovers fast, but there was a new tightness at the corner of his mouth that hadn't been there 10 minutes earlier. He flipped the laminated spec card between 2 fingers, once, twice, a habit that now looked less like confidence and more like something to occupy his hands, while his mind ran ahead of his mouth. One time, he said, forcing brightness back into his voice for the room's benefit. 1 rifle, 1 lucky pass in the dark. Folks, I'm not saying it wasn't impressive. It was, but my showpiece here is a modern reproduction, tuned to shop tolerances. Let's see how our friend does with something a little less forgiving. He turned toward Austin, and something in his tone shifted from performance to instruction. The old rack, the condemned service rifles in the case. Get one out. We'll run this again, same terms, and settle it properly. A murmur went through the room, half delight at the raised stakes, half unease that nobody could quite name. Austin looked toward the board table, toward Halloran, who had gone very still again, and toward the glass case with its faded stencil, and felt something in his stomach that had nothing to do with excitement. He crossed to the case a few minutes later, ostensibly to retrieve the key, and instead found himself standing in the narrow back office behind it, drawn there by nothing more than the itch that had bothered him all evening. A gray accordion file sat wedged behind a shelf of raffle supplies, sealed with a strip of tape gone yellow at the edges, Carrington Precision Arms embossed faintly across the folder's tab. Stapled to the front was a single sheet, A board agenda for Saturday noon. Item 4. Vote to condemn and auction antique service rack, pending inspection findings. He didn't open the sealed portion. He didn't yet know whose name might be written inside it, and some instinct, sharper than his 18 months of experience should have allowed, told him this was not a file to be read alone, in a back room, on the same night the man it concerned was standing 40 feet away with a rifle in his hands. He put it back exactly as he'd found it, key already forgotten in his other hand, and walked out to unlock the case, feeling the weight of Saturday noon settle over the evening, like a second, quieter clock ticking beneath the first. The rifle Austin lifted from the case was heavier than the reproduction, its stock dark with a century of oil and hands, a small stamped disc on the receiver's left flank, worn nearly smooth. He carried it to the felt table, the way you carry something you've been told, without being told outright, matters more than it looks like it should. Carrington took it from him and held it up for the room. This, he said, some of his showman's brightness returning now that the terms had shifted back in his favor, is one of the rifles currently flagged in this club's own inspection file as unreliable, worn, unsafe by any modern spec. He said it plainly, almost kindly, a man delivering hard news for the room's own good. I don't say that to insult anybody's history. I say it because a rifle that fails a man in the field isn't nostalgia, it's a liability. He said it on the felt, parts scattered under full light, exactly as before, Austin supervising the arrangement with hands that were not quite steady. Same terms, Carrington said. Lights out, prove me wrong. The room went dark a second time, and this time nobody whispered a count under their breath, because nobody quite trusted their own certainty anymore. Abner's hands moved through the darkness with the same fixed order as before, receiver, carrier, recoil assembly. But somewhere in the third beat of silence, his fingers slowed over one part in a way they had not slowed before. He turned the extractor between thumb and forefinger, feeling along its hooked edge with a patience the rest of the room could not see and could only measure by the pause in the room's collective breath. It was worn, not broken. Not unsafe by any spec and Carrington's laminated card would ever list, because a spec card measures dimension, not history, and this particular wear pattern told a story no caliper could read. Metal thinned not by age but by a specific, repeated failure to clean it on the schedule the rifle had once been built to survive. A rifle that fails a man in the field isn't nostalgia, Carrington had said, and he wasn't wrong about that either. He was only wrong about what had actually failed. Abner set the worn extractor aside, drew a replacement from the small kit Austin had laid out under supervised light, without knowing why he'd been asked to, and seated it home with the punch, the tool's private shape, fitting the pin exactly as it always had. The rifle came together whole in his hands, and the stopwatch, when the lights returned, read 9 seconds flat, slower than his first pass, but faster still than anything Carrington's own spec card had ever promised for a rifle he'd just called a liability. Carrington took the rifle from him to inspect it, turning it toward the light, and it was Austin, standing closest, who saw the stamped disc on the receiver's flank catch the light at an angle that made the worn numbers briefly legible, a date, 1987, and beneath it, ground shallow by decades of handling but not erased, a signature stamp no wider than a thumbnail. A. Sowell. Austin's mouth went dry. He looked up at Abner, who was watching Carrington's face rather than the rifle, with the patient attention of a man who has been waiting all evening for exactly this moment to arrive on its own. Carrington saw the stamp too. His hands stopped moving entirely, and for the first time all night, the laminated spec card stayed still in his fingers, forgotten. You certified this rifle, Carrington said, and his voice had lost the showman's polish entirely, gone flat and quiet in a way that made the whole room lean in to hear it. In 87, this is your signature. It is, Abner said. Then your name, Carrington said, and something in his own arithmetic seemed to be arriving late, the way a man's face changes when he finally does the sum he's been avoiding, is on the inspection my firm's report is built to overturn. Nobody in the room spoke. Somewhere near the back, Deke's microphone, still half raised, made a small feedback whine and then went silent. as if even the sound system understood that this was not a moment that wanted amplifying. Austin found himself speaking before he'd decided to. "There's a file," he said, to the room more than to anyone in particular, his voice unsteady but carrying anyway. "In the back office, sealed, Carrington Precision Arms letterhead. Board vote Saturday noon. Item 4. Condemn the rack. Auction it." He looked at Carrington, and something in his own face was rearranging itself in real time. "You wrote the report that's supposed to prove he was wrong, and his name was on the thing you were reporting on the whole time." Carrington set the rifle down on the felt, with a care that looked almost like reverence now, though his jaw was tight enough to show the muscle working beneath it. "I didn't know," he said, and it came out smaller than anything he'd said all evening. "I didn't. The inspection firm my company contracted flagged wear patterns against current spec. Nobody cross-referenced the original certification. I never saw a name. I saw numbers." He looked at the rifle, at the shallow stamp, at 8 decades of history he had apparently never once thought to ask about before deciding it was worthless. "By the numbers," he said again, quieter, and for the first time all night the phrase sounded less like a slogan and more like a confession. He didn't get to finish untangling it. The side door at the back of the room opened, cold air sliding in off the gravel lot, and a man in a windbreaker the color of gun blue stepped through it, moving with the particular unhurried authority of someone who has been in rooms like this one for 60 years and has stopped needing to hurry through any of them. Curtis Fenno was 74 years old, built low and solid, a retired Marine Corps chief warrant officer whose name still carried weight on this club's board, though he'd missed the last 3 meetings for reasons nobody had pressed him on. He crossed the floor without acknowledging the whiteboard, the felt table, or the $40,000 Barkston blue marker, his eyes finding Abner Sowell the way a compass needle finds north, immediately, and without any apparent effort at all. He didn't call out a greeting. He didn't extend a hand. He stopped 3 feet from the felt table, looked at the disassembled rifle and the worn extractor sitting to one side of it, and then, without preamble, without anyone asking him to, began to speak in a flat, procedural cadence that filled the silent room like water finding the low points of a floor. Receiver inspected for cracking at the takedown lug. Bolt face checked for pitting. Gauged against go and no-go. Extractor hook measured under glass, replaced at first sign of rounding. Chamber cast taken and logged. He recited it without pause, without a single wrong word, 37 years fallen away from his voice, as though the procedure had been read that morning, rather than remembered from a manual, neither he nor Abner had touched in decades. "That's the acceptance inspection for this rack. 1987. I know it because I signed the second line under his." He turned, finally, to the room, to the board members clustered near the bar, to Halloran, whose drink had gone warm and forgotten in his hand. "I signed under Abner Sowell's name because he was the better armorer of the 2 of us, and everybody who served with either of us knew it, including me." He said it plainly, the way a man states a fact he has made his peace with a long time ago, and is only now, for the first time, saying out loud in front of witnesses. He looked at Carrington then, and something in his face wasn't anger exactly. It was closer to the particular fatigue of a man setting down a weight he'd carried so long he'd nearly forgotten it was there. "Your firm flagged this rack 6 years ago," he said. "Sent a letter. I read it. I knew the wear they were describing wasn't design failure. It was maintenance failure. Decades of the club skipping the cleaning schedule Abner wrote into the original manual. I could have said so then. Would have cost me an afternoon and an uncomfortable phone call." He paused, and for the first time, his composed voice found something close to strain, not a crack, but a slowing, a man choosing each next word carefully because the ones before it had cost him something to say. "I let it sit, filed it, told myself it wasn't my fight anymore." He looked at Abner directly now. "I've owed you that phone call for 6 years, and I owe you worse than that for the 30 before it. For every year I let people forget whose name built this club's whole armory practice and never once said different." The room held that silence the way it had held the darkness during the blackout round, total, unwilling to be the first to break it. Abner didn't answer right away. He looked at Curtis for a long moment, then down at the rifle on the felt table, at the small stamped disc catching the overhead light. "You said it now," Abner said finally, which was not forgiveness exactly, and not absolution, but was, in its plain economy, very nearly both. He hadn't come tonight for an apology, and it showed in the way he received it. Not coldly, but without the hunger of a man who'd been waiting for it. He'd come, if anyone had asked him plainly, because a rifle that fails a man in the field is a promise broken, and he had spent 22 years teaching recruits that a broken promise, once made, doesn't stay broken by accident. It stays broken because somebody let it. He hadn't fixed rifles because the club paid him to. He'd fixed them because care, once given, doesn't come with an expiration printed anywhere on the parts list, and Abner Sowell had never in his life broken a promise on purpose, and he wasn't about to let his name be used to suggest that he had. The board's Saturday vote never happened in the form the agenda had described. Halloran called an emergency session 2 days early, in the same room, under the same lights, and the item on the agenda was rewritten by hand before it was ever typed. Not condemnation, but reinstatement. The antique rack returned to service, under the original 1987 certification, Abner's signature and Curtis's both, side by side, exactly as they'd always been. Carrington stood at the back of that meeting rather than the front, no laminated spec card in his hand this time, and when Halloran called for public comment, he asked to speak first. He kept it short. He said his firm's report had measured wear against a modern tolerance that had never once accounted for a maintenance schedule nobody had followed in 20 years, and that the fault the club needed to correct wasn't in the rifles. He withdrew his replacement contract without being asked to and offered, instead, free inspection and maintenance service for the antique rack twice yearly, at his own firm's cost, for as long as the club wanted it. Nobody clapped. It wasn't that kind of room anymore. But Austin, watching from the back, saw something in Carrington's face that looked less like a man performing contrition and more like one who had actually, finally, done the arithmetic all the way through. Weeks passed and then months, the quarry building settling back into its ordinary rhythm of Tuesday leagues and quiet Sunday cleanings. A small glass case went up near the east wall in October, though nobody made a ceremony of it, just Austin and Halloran, and a maintenance man with a level, mounting it flush against the limestone. Inside it now sat the 1987 service rifle, its worn extractor replaced and its stamped disc polished just enough to be legible, and beside it, resting in a shallow felt-lined groove cut to its exact shape, the disassembly punch Abner had carried in his coat pocket for longer than most of the club's members had been alive. Beneath both, a small brass plaque, unadorned, carried only 2 lines, his name, and the single word beneath it, Armorer. Some names only get spoken once they've been proven right. Tell us whose name that was for you. Abner walked home that last night the way he always did, unhurried, his coat buttoned against the evening chill, the pocket lighter now than it had been in decades, though he still reached for it out of habit more than once along the gravel road. Ahead of him, up the rise where the drive bent past the fence line, the porch light was already burning, yellow and steady, exactly as it had burned for 52 years, whether he was 5 minutes out or 5 hours. Twyla was there in the doorway when he came up the steps, not asking where he'd been, not needing to, because some questions in a marriage that long had long since answered themselves. He climbed the 2 steps slowly, favoring the shoulder that never rose past his chest, and she reached out and touched his sleeve, once, the way she always did, and together they went inside, and the porch light stayed on, a while longer before it too, finally went dark.